Hello, AP American History and CCP US History students. Today we're going to talk about the American Revolution. America secedes from the British Empire. So, the last time that we talked, we got to this slide where I talked about, or I said I would talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the revolutionary conflict later. And the idea here is that there are some pretty distinct advantages on both sides. And obviously, those advantages cause disadvantages on the other side. So they pretty much move exclusively. When it came to the British, they were the larger empire. They were the empire. They had a larger population. They had a professional army. They had a professional navy that was really unmatched in the world. They had all of the economic favors in their advantage. They were trade partners with all of the major players in the world. They, because of mercantilism, had made a great deal of money, and certainly had the United Colonies over a barrel, really, when it came to economics, because by them rebelling, trade would basically cease between the British and the American colonies, which, while that would cut off some vital lines of raw materials for the English, and it would hurt them, the only hope really is for a long conflict, because if you hurt these merchants long enough, the war would become a very, very unpopular thing back in England. So that kind of was the advantage of the colonies at that point. The colonies were going to be hurt by the absence of trade. There's no question that was going to be a problem. Their advantage was they were fighting a defensive war. They were fighting at home. They knew the territory. They could raise reinforcements from the local countryside. They could feed themselves on the local countryside. Now, of course, this could be a disadvantage over time because the local farmers are going to be upset by this conflict as well. But the length of conflict is actually going to be, and I think most Americans forget, the conflict lasted from the first shots at Lexington in 1775 until the peace agreement in 1783. That long, protracted time period is going to play into the colonists' favor because, again, the British merchants are going to get tired of fighting a war. Now, of course, another advantage in this is that the American colonies are technically fighting a civil war. They're fighting against their homeland. In many cases, they're fighting against friends and family. Granted, displaced, you're talking about people that live back in England and now people that live in the colonies generationally separated from each other. But this is a civil war. This is a fight against their homeland. So there are going to be some issues pertaining to that as well. And of course, when it comes down to it, when a rebellion occurs, there is always an advantage to the rebeller because the rebeller is passionate about it. They feel strongly about it. The Declaration of Independence is going to kind of encapsulate their thinking. The British don't really have that passion. You're talking about holding on to a colony, and how are these foot soldiers actually benefiting from that? They're not. This is a conflict to kind of help out the merchants and help out the lords and help out the admiralty and help out the king. But is this really a conflict that is benefiting them as individuals? The answer is probably not. Okay, so when it comes down to it, there are some key advantages, and really the advantages can be summed up in England is an empire, and they walk, talk, and act like an empire. They have the economy of an empire. They have the political stability of an empire. The Americans are really kind of slapdash throwing this together. So they don't really have that advantage. They don't have a established government. They don't have an established economy, at least on their own. And of course, the major disadvantage for the colonies is that they don't have an ally. They're going to work on that, but they don't. It's not like France immediately jumps to their aid, or the Dutch or the Spanish or anybody else. So they're kind of flying on their own for a while, which is why it's rough going at the very beginning. Okay. Now, the advantage that the Americans definitely do have is they have an exceptional brand of leadership. They have the George Washingtons leading the troops, which George Washington I make fun of for being wonderful at running away, but that was actually the strategy of a defensive war, that you fight, but then you live to fight another day after that conflict. So he is absolutely the right person to be in charge of this ragtag group of soldiers, because even when they have early successes at Bunker Hill, even though Bunker Hill was actually a loss, the Americans had to vacate the hill. they took a tremendous toll on the British at that battle. The Battle of Long Island was completely embarrassing to both Washington and to the colonial troops, and the Battle of Manhattan, I should say, or Harlem Heights over in New York. So what collectively is known as the Battle of New York doesn't work out either, and that happens after the Declaration of Independence. I think a lot of people kind of forget that this was in the balance when they signed that document. There were good chances that we were going to lose the war, which would have been cataclysmic for these colonial leaders who were signing the document. But we'll get to that here in a bit. But again, the advantage definitely is that we have a rare breed of leadership. We have Washington commanding the troops, along with some of his subordinates, who we'll get to here in a bit. And you have, of course, the colonial leadership in Congress, the Franklins, the Adams, the Jeffersons of the world, who are providing a pretty solid base of understanding of not only what we're fighting for and what we're going to develop after the conflict is done. So these soldiers feel like they really have something to fight for, whereas the British soldiers are merely fighting for king and for country, but really can't explain why. Okay. Now, of course, Washington, like I said, is a very solid choice to lead the troops. He is selected by the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. He is a member of that Congress. Now, to be fair, he does show up almost kind of lobbying and jockeying for the job because he shows up in a military uniform. He shows up to Congress where other guys are dressed in suits, and they are there to be leaders of their colonies. He is there to kind of lobby for the position of the commanding officer. The guy who really wants it is John Hancock. John Hancock from Massachusetts. He's a career smuggler. He calls himself a merchant, but in reality, he is a smuggler, and he has made his money doing that, and he's been very successful at it. But he has not a lick of military experience. He still thinks he's going to get the job, though, because he can afford to kind of outfit his own soldiers. He can afford to support the army. So he kind of expects it. That he had been elevated to the leader of the Second Continental Congress, and he kind of expected the Second Continental Congress to then put him in the leadership of the troops. That would have been absolutely the worst idea to do. It would not have worked, and John Hancock is kind of blinded by his own ambition. So instead, when they kind of deviate from that, the Second Continental Congress then looks towards who could be the better choice. Now, the reasons against George Washington is so far they have only fought in New England. And there was concern that are the New Englanders from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island going to follow a man from Virginia? Okay. Another reason, he is a very wealthy man. Is this really the best choice for a war to get a bunch of small, dejected farmers to follow a massive landholding, slaveholding elite like George Washington? And of course, another thing, he's never been a general before. The highest rank he ever got was a colonel in the British Army. Now, of course, he was elevated within the American militias, but that really didn't count. So Washington is not a career soldier where he is, got this long resume of success. In fact, another reason against is his resume has been one of running away. Yes, he kind of starts the French and Indian War, but he immediately gets himself involved in a debacle at Fort Necessity where he has to surrender. And then during the conflict, his shining moment of glory is helping the British to run away from Braddock's campaign that was a complete and total disaster. So it's not like he's got this stellar resume that shows that he is the man for the job. But the reasons for are quite similar in nature, really. He is a landed elite, but he doesn't act like it. He's not somebody that walks into a room and just expects immediate respect because he's got land and title and whatever else. He actually earns his keep. He is a quiet, dignified man. He doesn't talk very much. Now, much has been made about his lack of talking and communicating. A lot of that stems from the fact that, number one, he's kind of a shy guy. He's not your eloquent speaker or anything like that. And he also is very aware that he has a limited education comparative to these other people. Adams is a Harvard scholar. Thomas Jefferson went to William and Mary. These guys are learned individuals. They have read extensively. Washington never went to college. He was not classically trained in that regard. And it's mostly because his father and his brother died young. And so Washington had to kind of take over the family finances and run the plantation, as well as the western lands that are associated with him. So he's kind of the graduate of life, if you will. He's gone out and lived and studied to become a land surveyor, and he's kind of a hard scrabble guy, even though he's got this huge amount of land and very easily could just become a plantation farmer sitting on his porch watching his slaves do all the work. Washington's a hard worker in his own right and does his own thing. He is an accomplished guy. He is a commanding presence. He's always the tallest guy in the room. Jefferson's about 6'2". Washington's about 6'3", 6'4". So he's always a little bit taller than everybody else in the room. And this is at a time period where most people were 5'7". So he is literally, about a head taller than everybody else. He's exceptionally muscular. He is a wonderful horseman. He's somebody that just kind of commands respect because he's a physical specimen. Women love George Washington. They find him absolutely irresistible, and yet he is a very devoted family man. He ends up marrying a widow by the name of Mary Custis, or Martha Custis, I should say. Martha, of course, becomes Martha Washington. She actually has more land than he does when they get married, because she had inherited the land from her husband, and it was passed, of course, through marriage to Washington. Martha actually had more slaves than he did too, so he kind of inherits that through the marriage as well. So George and Martha are a very, very powerful couple because of this, and they rise to the top of Virginia society. So the final decision of the Continental Congress is to go with this guy because he's so widely respected, and because, again, he campaigns for the job. But Washington definitely ends up being the smart decision, because his resume says he's very good at running away, and in a defensive war, that's what you have to do. So it's a very prescient decision by this Continental Congress to do that. Now, of course, this is on the heels of the Battle of Bunker Hill, which happens in June of 1775. After Lexington and Concord, the American colonial army, which again at this point is a very ragtag group of volunteers, they rally around Boston, basically to hem in the British. And the British decide that they are going to attack this army, thinking, well, if we line up in our rows and we march up this hill, and of course, this is a misnamed battle. It's called the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was actually fought on Breed's Hill, which is right next to it. But needless to say, the British form up, and they decide to march up this hill to try and scare the colonials away, because they had this vision that if they formed up in their colors and they marched at them, that the American soldiers would merely throw their weapons down and run away in fear. They did not expect the Americans to actually fight. And more importantly, they did not expect the Americans to fight a coordinated battle. Now, while the British ended up getting them removed from the hill and they ended up winning the battle, it was at a tremendous cost. Hundreds of British soldiers were killed. Even more were wounded. This was a complete and total decimation of the forces of the British. And the British were stubborn. They kept walking up this hill in a straight line and just taking the fire of these American soldiers. Now, they eventually did manage to get to the top of the hill, run it over, and kill a lot of the people, including John Adams' good friend and his own personal physician, Dr. Joseph Warren. They managed to kind of kill all the people at the top of the hill that they had surrounded. Some of them, of course, got away, but this was a rallying cry for the colonials that not only can we stand with these people, if we have the right leadership and the right amount of ammunition and the right amount of reinforcements, we can not only stand with them, but we can fight them and win. Now, it was on the heels of that we sent the Olive Branch petition from the Second Continental Congress over to King George III. Now, King George III, of course, receives this. We talked about this the other day in the Zoom call. George III gets this Olive Branch petition and immediately just ignores it. He refuses to even bother with it. And his next action is to declare the colonies in rebellion. This kind of goes along with the mentality that if you declare that we are, in fact, in rebellion, then we are rebelling. Then we must be independent. We must be fighting for something specifically. So weirdly enough, King George III's actions here kind of push us even farther towards an independence movement. And he actually convinces a number of colonial leaders that we are, in fact, an independent group of nations because of that. He also takes steps to bolster his military because he realizes he's in a long, protracted fight here by hiring German mercenaries named Hessians. That's because they are predominantly from the Hesse region of Germany. That is what is today Mainz and Frankfurt area of Germany. Germany had not formed up into the unified country that it is today. That doesn't happen until the late 1800s under Otto von Bismarck. So these local kind of princes and kings of these German principalities would hire their soldiers out for hire. So these young men would go off and fight. And the reason it was so popular is the king would get paid not only for the usage of the military, but if those people died during war, he got paid for that as well. So it's kind of a screwy system, but the Germans basically became professional soldiers, which scared the living daylights out of the American colonists because not only were these Hessians very good at what they did, they didn't care one little bit about these colonials, So if the British captured these guys, the colonists could surrender, raise their hands, and be put into a prison ship or something, which was pretty awful in its own right. But the Hessians, they just bayonet them. They just put the bayonets on their weapons and stab them to death because they didn't care one little bit. So the Hessians definitely caused a fear within the colonists. Now, of course, the first thing that we try and do after Bunker Hill is we try and invade Canada. And why? Because we're trying to make it the 14th colony. There's a fear that the British are going to use that as a staging ground, which they were correct. It was going to be a staging ground for invasion, that, they had a home, if you will, that was not inhabited by people resisting their rule. So we did try and invade Canada and the hope is that we could run all the British authorities off and that the old French people and the British colonists would realize, oh, hey, we're in the same type of struggle. The problem is that we invade during the winter time. We leave during the fall, and by the time we get up into Canada, it's the middle of winter, and we're not exactly prepared for it. We also fail to understand that the Canadian mentality is not, oh, we need revolution. They were totally content with the British rule as it was, and so it failed. The effect on 1776 of early 1776 on America is that we start realizing this is going to be either a long, protracted war, or we start realizing that we probably are going to lose this. Now, one of the positives that comes out of this is we end up realizing we have some pretty decent leadership. One of the people that's going to come out of that is Benedict Arnold. Now, at this point, Benedict Arnold is considered to be a rising star in the American military, and he is a hero during this conquest of Canada. He's going to be a hero again in just a little bit, but that kind of sets the table for one of the biggest and most treacherous acts of treason against the Americans by Benedict Arnold. So his name comes up quite a bit during the American Revolution. In the early stages, it's always positive, but it's a pretty big negative later on. Now, of course, during this time period, we're trying to convince people that rebellion is the way to go. And I've mentioned it before, but the law of a third. You have a third of the people during this time period who are revolutionaries. You have a third who are loyal to Great Britain. And you have a third of people who are just, I just want to farm and I don't care which way it goes. And you can see the law of the third averages in our politics. There's a third of the American public that is absolutely in favor of Donald Trump, a third that is absolutely in favor of Joe Biden, and a third of the country basically is waiting for the whole election to be over. They don't care one little bit. Okay, they just want it to be done. They see no difference. And so that's kind of what's happening during the American Revolution as well. There are colonists who are absolutely on board with independence. There are others who are absolutely on board with staying British. And there are others who are they're just trying to live their life. So loyalty to Britain is a problem within the colonies. And it raises the question, do we need to declare independence to bring people to that side? But the counter argument is if we declare independence, wouldn't that be too extreme for some people and scare them back to the British? So that's why the importance of Thomas Paine on our American independence movement is so severe. He writes a pamphlet called Common Sense. Now, he writes it in a very simplistic form of English. He writes it very direct and to the point, and it's a small pamphlet. It's not a huge book. Now, the effect on the colonies is that this gets passed around. It's one of the most published works in American history, and it's passed around from household to household. People take it to the local pubs and read it. It becomes a subject of open debate within society, and a number of people, for the first time, are seeing the arguments for independence, and he's labeling it as the common sense movement. And he's talking about is the king the legitimate form of government? Are the American colonies really supposed to participate in mercantilism? And he raises all the issues that are mentioned eventually in the Declaration of Independence, but he puts it in a very simplistic, understandable way. And it's really the first solid form of American propaganda. He takes what the Sons of Liberty have been doing and really puts a professional tone to it. The effect on Congress is that a number of congressmen who have been against independence start to sway their opinion. They've read Thomas Paine too, and they have realized that their colonial subjects, the people from the colonies that they're representing, have also read it and are now being swayed towards independence. So Thomas Paine definitely does put it in simplest terms for people to understand and then move towards an independence movement within the colonies. Now, Paine's view, of course, is that we're going to be transitioning to republicanism. And we talked about it in the previous presentation, that we're moving towards a government where the people are really going to choose their government. And of course, Paine writes, those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigue of supporting it. Paine's view is even amplified more later on in this conflict when he writes The Crisis, when he basically puts out there that these are the times that try men's souls. Well, that's during a very tough part of the American Revolution when our soldiers are down and out. And so he also comes back and really kind of provides a good kind of summation of what we're really fighting for. So Thomas Paine has a huge impact. Now, Thomas Paine is a great revolutionary, but he finds out he's not very solid when it comes to peace. So when the American Revolution is done, he really is an agitator to the point where he annoys people and they just want to get him away because we've already done that, Tom. We're already done with that. Thomas Paine eventually goes over to France and gets arrested during the French Revolution for being an even bigger revolutionary over there. So Paine really is somebody that is just a career agitator, somebody that is kind of, very good in the moment when it comes to a revolutionary mindset, but not very good when it's just sitting around. He really can't sit still and enjoy what has been accomplished so far. It's always got to go one step farther. But bottom line is, there are some colonial examples of this republicanism. We've talked about town halls. We've talked about the House of Burgesses. There is kind of a general feeling within the colonies that we can run our own affairs. And the idea that citizens have virtue, that the Americans truly believe that, hey, we have kind of behaved ourselves. We've been good citizens. We've been good subjects of the king. And now he's not really holding up his end of the bargain. So therefore, if he's not going to do it, they're subscribing to this social contract theory that, well, if they're not doing it, then maybe we create our own. Okay, so republicanism is very strong within the colonial model of the American mindset. The American mindset is definitely on board with this. They've read the Enlightenment thought. They've paired it up with their religious teachings. They've got colonial examples. There are methodologies in our history as colonies that really kind of play up the idea that we can run our own affairs. Now, of course, Jefferson's push for independence would not have happened if not for Richard Henry Lee going back to Virginia and convincing the Virginia legislature that they had to declare independence. So in early June, Richard Henry Lee returns and he basically makes a statement, a resolution. He grants or gives a resolution on independence that basically says Virginia says we ought to be independent. Now, they list some reasons for it, but it's a very brief passage. The importance of it is somebody other than Massachusetts was proposing independence, and it was the largest state at the time, both in land mass in many cases. It depends on if you're counting their western lands that they claimed, and with population. So you're talking about the largest state or the largest colony in the colonies proposing independence. So it can't be ignored anymore, and it's outside the region that had been already fighting. And a committee on independence is formed. It is formed with Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams, and then two others that kind of get overlooked, Robert Livingston of New York and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Now, they come together as a committee. They decide they need to write a document, and the document ends up becoming the Declaration of Independence. Now, we talked about it the other day that it comes in four different sections. You can see it's just one page, the large signature of John Hancock at the bottom. And we kind of went through that, hey, we start off with the preamble, then there are natural rights, then the tyrannous misdeeds of George III, where they list out all the problems, and then, of course, the impact overall. Now, when they write this out, when Jefferson writes this out to send it off, the purpose is not just to inform King George III that we're done. It's also to convince the Americans that are fence sitting that, hey, you need to come over to the independence side, and here's why. But it's also a letter to the French to try and get them on our side as well. Jefferson publishes this. The committee presents this. They rip it to shreds, really, within the Congress, talking about wording. And if you ever watch the musical 1776 or the excellent miniseries on John Adams from HBO, there is a passage in there from Thomas Jefferson, who is a very prosperous landowner in Virginia. He's got a tremendous amount of slaves himself, but he also kind of blames the king for slavery. Now, it's a misguided blame because it's not George III's fault for the slave trade, but they kind of throw it on him in the original. If you go back and look at the original drafting of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson writes in the Declaration that this is a terrible, abominable practice and needs to be eliminated. The South is the one that kind of crosses that out. They say, we're not going along with that. Adams really kind of fights for that. So does Franklin to a degree. They do want to get rid of slavery, but they realize the bigger issue at this point is independence, and that they would kind of win the war and then deal with it. They don't realize that it's going to take us literally 77 years, as Abraham Lincoln would later put it, to solve that issue. It's going to take us 80 plus years to get around to solving that issue, and we legitimately have to fight a war to do it. They don't see that in 1776, but by the 1860s, it becomes a reality. Now, of course, this is the artistic rendering of the signing of the Declaration, or at least the report of the Declaration Committee. Adams is here to the left, the balding guy that's a little bit shorter than Jefferson. Jefferson, of course, is, as I said, about 6'2", which is an uncommon height for anybody at that time. And they are presenting their document to John Hancock and the rest of the Second Continental Congress. You can see Franklin in the background, and of course, by a lesser degree, Livingston in the very back, and Roger Sherman standing right behind Thomas Jefferson. Sherman's going to become very important during the Constitution fight, and he's going to have a tremendous compromise that saves the Constitution. That's, of course, something that we're going to talk about another day, but I do want to draw, again, another distinction that this is the Declaration, not the Constitution. Okay, Constitution is 13 years later. So he presents the Declaration of Independence to the Second Continental Congress, and these people, and look, the room does not look like this. This is a complete propaganda piece, if you will, made well after the fact. It's not like they had a painter there that was painting them in life. This is an artistic rendering years after the fact, and it's not even close to correct as to how the actual Pennsylvania State House looked when they were signing this document. But bottom line is, the artistic rendering does kind of present us with a feeling like this. These men are all supporting this document. What a momentous occasion! This was definitely a propaganda piece after the fact, because it was not well received when it first was submitted. And a lot of these guys would have been on their feet yelling and screaming and talking about how there were parts of this document that they did not particularly care for. So it wasn't as easy a process as this artistic rendering makes it, but they do end up producing the document. Now, of course, right after that, we are talking about an issue between patriots and loyalists. Now it's a pretty clear distinction. You have to choose a side. You can no longer be neutral in this, because we are either fighting for our independence or you are fighting to remain part of Great Britain. It makes it very clear that there's one way of doing it or another, and no in the middle. So now, who are the patriots? The patriots are the ones that have rallied to the cause of independence. They have rallied to the cause of fighting for things. The loyalists, of course, are the ones that are rallying to stay a part of the empire. and the Loyalists really want to stay a part of the empire. Now, the treatment is not good on both sides during the American Revolution. The weird part is after the Revolution, when the Patriots win, the Loyalists are actually treated fairly well. And that's part of the peace agreement, but it's a little odd that during this fight, the Loyalists really kind of are treated well after the fact. But during the struggle, it's not good. And one of the worst places is South Carolina. Now, before that, we have to get through the Battle of New York, which starts with the Battle of Long Island. The Battle of Long Island is a complete and total disaster. The local New Yorkers really are kind of the neutral folks, so they kind of take whichever side is occupying them at the time. The American army is absolutely embarrassed. They have to abandon Long Island. Luckily for them, they're able to get across the East River and into Manhattan, but that falls apart too, and they have to escape to New Jersey, and then it's a long slog across New Jersey, being chased by the British military. And again, it's Washington doing a great job of keeping the soldiers together, just making sure the army lives to fight another day. And of course, later on, he has a genius stroke that after all these depressing losses, he manages to get them across the Delaware River. And attacking Trenton on Christmas night in 1776. And the Battle of Trenton ends up capturing and killing a number of Hessians. And then he actually does another masterstroke. He goes up to Princeton and manages to defeat a British army there, albeit very quickly and momentary. I mean, it's one of those where they win and then have to leave. But Washington actually does have this masterstroke at the very end of 1776 that not only saves the army, but saves the mentality of revolution. And of course, this is another artist's rendering. It's a German artist that paints this in the mid 1800s. It's a propaganda piece. You got Washington standing in the boat. You got Monroe standing behind him with the American flag. And of course, you've got 13 people in the boat. It's supposed to be symbolic of all the colonies. And there are questions as to whether or not, this is a fisherman. This is a Western frontiersman. This might be a woman. We're not exactly sure. These two right here look like Native Americans. You've got all these different groups of people being represented as the colonies, if you will. But of course, this is artistic rendering. There was no ice flow like this in the Delaware River. The Delaware River is not as big and deep as this makes it seem. Washington, it's Christmas night. It's snowing and sleeting. He's not going to be standing up like this. He's going to be down, huddled together like these guys back here. But bottom line is the artistic rendering kind of shows the daring nature of this conquest, if you will. But bottom line is the British end up failing because of Trenton and a number of other things. They attempt basically to capture the Hudson River, and that fails. They do, in fact, capture Philadelphia, but then perplexingly sit there and don't go after Washington. They let him go into Valley Forge and kind of freeze over the winter. But again, they freeze and they suffer, but they still stay together. And then General John Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny as he's known, walks into a trap up in upstate New York called the Battle of Saratoga. He loses to a general by the name of Horatio Gates, but in reality, he loses because of the daring nature of Benedict Arnold. This is Benedict Arnold's high point in October 1777. Now, because of that, we are able to get French allies. Why France? Because they're the natural enemy of the English. They had been fighting war upon war for years. And of course, why not France? Well, they're a monarchy. They're scary too. This is not exactly the ally that we want. We want an ally that's maybe more Republican in nature, democratic principles. There aren't any. We're the only one. So the effect of Franklin on this is to kind of ease the French into this conflict, and the idea is that the American colonies have been offered home rule, which is the idea that you handle the stuff at home and that the British handle the foreign policies. Franklin's not okay with that, and he pushes for an alliance with the French as a way of really kind of scaring the British. But at the same time, he uses the British as a way to scare the French that, hey, we've been offered home rule. We could just take it. And then the empire is even stronger. And that scares the French, too. So because of that and the Battle of Saratoga, the information coming in about that, we're able to secure not only the French alliance when it comes to the army and the navy, but also money as well, which we desperately needed. Now, of course, this then becomes a world war. The French help arrives. Benedict Arnold ends up becoming a traitor to the British side. He was passed over for a a promotion, and he really takes it the wrong way. Plus, he's got a wife that is much younger than him and really likes fine things, and so Arnold kind of. It kind of does the show me the money type mentality where he tells the British that he'll sell out West Point, which is a fort at the time and a military installation, in exchange for a commission within the British military. He ends up escaping. His whole thing falls apart, if you will, and a guy is hanged. A guy named Major John Andre is hanged as a spy because of this. But Benedict Arnold ends up becoming public enemy number one for the colonials during this time period. Now, right after he sells out, Washington would have turned to Benedict Arnold to go and fight in the South. Instead, he has to find a new leadership type. And this is another thing Washington's very good. He finds diamonds in the rough. He finds people like Nathaniel Greene, this guy pictured to the bottom right, who ends up kind of fighting the same style of warfare that Washington is fighting in the South, realizing I can lose every battle but still win the war. Greene does a phenomenal job of that all throughout the Carolina campaign. And he stretches out the resources of Lord Cornwallis's British force so much that Cornwallis has to retreat to the seaside, hoping to get support. But because of the job of the not only American Navy, which barely exists, and the efforts of people like John Paul Jones, and the privateers, which is a nice way of saying pirates. The British Navy had already been depleted, but when the French show up, it's even more of a problem, and the British really struggle to supply their own soldiers, which leads to the debacle of General Lord Charles Cornwallis, pictured here, at the Battle of Yorktown, when he is basically trapped on a peninsula in Virginia and is basically incapable of escaping. When that happens, the end is near. The reason this whole force has to surrender. Now, the war isn't over. There's still a British force up in New York under the command of General Howe and later General Clinton. They still are in the field, if you will, but the British will to fight was basically done, which leads to a peace agreement in Paris. When in doubt, where are peace treaties signed? When in doubt, it's Paris. The British issues are, hey, can we still hold on to Canada? Can we still hold on to some of the colonial land? They're kind of concerned about what the American colonies are going to become. They're still kind of wondering, can we hold on to them in a weird way where we give them a ton of freedom, home rule and whatever else, but they're still part of our sphere of influence. The Americans want no part of it. Now, the peace negotiations at first go a little rough because, again, the British are really holding strong. But as this war becomes more and more of a detriment to British policies, as the French start to get more and more involved, they start realizing this is going to be very bad for the empire as a whole. So they signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The British concede our independence at that point. We like to look at 1776 as our Declaration of Independence, and that's when we're independent. We're not really officially independent until this treaty in 1783. They also concede the Western Territory, what eventually becomes Ohio, and the Northwest Territory, but they don't really leave, and that becomes a problem later on. Now, the Americans also concede a number of things as well. We kind of give up on the idea of taking any of Canada. We give up on the fact that we're going to take any of Florida. We give up on the Mississippi River. There are a lot of things that we concede, and we don't really enforce this idea that the British have to leave in general, which, again, this is one of those things where at the time it seems like a good idea just to kind of get done with it, wipe our hands of it and move on. But this is laying the groundwork for what eventually becomes the War of 1812. But that's a story for another day. Bottom line is we start as a new nation. And the United States is what we kind of adopt as our title, and everything on the white here ends up becoming our territory. And of course, this is disputed territory out down what eventually becomes Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and parts of Louisiana. And of course, Spain inherits Florida again from this because, again, this is a war. Spain also ends up taking the Western territories, if you will. Great Britain's still up in Canada. But bottom line is, because we negotiate with the British directly, the French feel a little left out here, and they feel like we could have gotten more had we negotiated with them. But again, we didn't feel that we wanted to do that. The peace agreement that was drawn up in Paris, drawn up again by people who are pretty solid in what they're doing, Adams, Franklin, all the rest of them, they don't want to really draw up a peace proposal that includes the French, because again, that might be a symbol of monarchy as well. In the end, we do end up getting our independence. That's how the American Revolution basically happened in a nutshell. If you have any questions, obviously reach out through office hours or through email. And please keep up reading in your book. And we'll move on towards Confederacy, which is the Articles of Confederation, and eventually the Constitution next week. Have a good one, folks.